Yasher Koach. Before we continue with the prayer for the state of Israel, I want to pause for a few minutes to reflect on what's going on. I tried to send out an email, I sent out an email earlier this week with some of the explanations of the causes of this conflict and obviously some of the very challenging pictures of our friends, relatives, and almost all of Israel in their bomb shelters. I wanted to share a little bit of a different portrait. This one comes from Yitzhak Sokolov, who works with Keshet Tours, who's led us on trips to Israel and who leads some of the other trips, including Gan's trip and I believe Camp Yavne's trip to Israel. And I'm excited that Yavne, Ramah, and USY are sending their groups to Israel this summer. He wanted to share a few of vignettes with us, and I wanted to pass them along to you. Last Friday evening, a week ago, he and his wife went to the Kotel. He hadn't been there in a while. And at first, things seemed perfectly fine, although, of course, there were fewer tourists. The men's side was filled with a wide range of Israelis, from Haredim in full gear to kids post-high school sporting ponytails and jeans. Services were boisterous with singing and dancing. But at one point, background noise from the Temple Mount above us became louder and louder as fireworks set off by the Arab population as part of Ramadan celebrations were gradually replaced by the sounds of shock grenades thrown by the Israeli police, responding to the hundreds of thousands of worshippers who began pelting them with stones and threatening the Jewish worshippers like myself, who was below on the Kotel Plaza. I couldn't see any of the action above, but later reports were terrible that dozens of police and hundreds of Palestinians were injured. We went off to dinner with no clue that within a few days the rioting would spread to all the mixed cities in Israel and that Hamas would launch almost 2,000 missiles at us. On Shabbat afternoon, Yitzhak writes that he joined a group of residents in the city of David for a tour on the other side of the road in the Arab neighborhood of Silwan. The purpose of the tour was to visit houses that had been built by Yemenite Jewish immigrants in the 1880s. That community was forced out in 1938 during what became known as the Arab Revolt. The Jordanians took over the area 10 years later, along with the rest of what became known as East Jerusalem. In the early 1960s, King Hussein decided to clean up the former Jewish quarter, which had provided homes for Palestinian refugees from 1948. To do so, he moved them into the former homes of these Yemenite Jews. They, their children, and grandchildren are now at the center of a legal and political controversy over a Supreme Court decision to recognize the original property rights of the Yemenite Jews. And in the case of this neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, the Supreme Court is trying to find a middle ground between the two sides. It practically begged the Arab families to avoid eviction and stay on as protected tenants by paying a nominal rent to the original Jewish owners. That hasn't worked in either place because too many people have an interest in exploiting the Palestinian situation of the Palestinian families are being used as a tool in this struggle for Jerusalem. As a result, those who face eviction are either unwilling or unable to accept any compromise, even if they really want to, as some have told me personally. Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah have become huge issues with terrible optics for Israel. But the Israeli legal system operates without political intervention. The all or nothing approach usually comes at a high price, as in the case of Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah are proving to be no exception. And of course, removing these families would open the issue of all of the families in West Jerusalem who now occupy Arab homes after the 1948 war. The third vignette he shares is that for the last 2 years, he's been studying on Monday afternoons on an Arabic class. This has been moved to Zoom, where he has 10 different computer screens. Suddenly, in the middle of the class, he writes, "I heard the sounds of sirens." Precisely at 6 p.m., Hamas launched the first salvo of the war with their first attack on Jerusalem since 2014. A few minutes later, the class had relocated to our protected rooms, mini bomb shelters in our houses, and we resumed the class as if nothing happened. But of course, something had. The fourth vignette is very early the next morning. I found myself driving my daughter Einat to her Air Force base near Ashdod. She had been home on leave and was suddenly summoned to return. After dropping her off, I drove down to Ashkelon to check in on Gasha Melede, a new immigrant who I had first met on a trip to Ethiopia in 2013. Gasha was the gabbai of the synagogue in Gondar, Ethiopia, and it took him almost 8 years to get to Israel. In the interim, my friend Yossi Yenan and I helped him go through nursing school so that he would have a trade when he first got here. And of course, that just happened a few months ago. I found him and his wife, Adna, and their 8-year-old son, Eliezer, and 3-year-old daughter, Abigail, sitting in their tiny apartment in the Beit Canada Absorption Center. Soon after arriving there, sirens started going off, and we made our way to the stairwell, a ritual repeated every half an hour. Finally, I suggested to the whole family that they come to my house, which was much further away in the center of the country, which has never been on a Hamas target list as far as I know. Gashar responded, "We came to live in Israel in peace, but we are also willing to be here in war. It wouldn't be loyal to my community or to the people of Ashkelon if I were to bring my family to your house now. We will come visit you when there is peace again." I was wowed by his remarks. Since I understood what he was saying, I too decided to stay. I spent the rest of the day with 15 Ethiopian families, all huddled in an outdated bomb shelter as Hamas hurled 100 rockets at a time at Ashkelon. In between the sirens, we celebrated a Brit Milah for the newest addition to the family, a baby whose parents named him Israel. Would that I would end this story on such a positive note, but elsewhere in Ashkelon, 2 women were killed and 1 rocket fell on the parking lot of this same absorption center. Several apartments were badly damaged, and one of the Ethiopian men was wounded by shrapnel in the leg. Finally, this morning, I took it upon myself to do the shopping for my extended family for the duration, as well as Shabbat and Shavuot at the local supermarket, which is on the Etzion block outside of Jerusalem. I stopped first at our neighboring Palestinian village and picked up my friend Ratib, who had his own shopping list for the feast ending Ramadan. The result of the confluence of Jewish and Muslim holidays was a very long checkout line at the supermarket, full of Israeli and Palestinians who spoke to each other politely, helped each other find elusive items hiding on the shelves, and made way for each other's shopping carts, even in the middle of a war. I don't know where things are headed right now, and I'm not sure that any of us do. As I write from my part-time home in Yerucham, the red alert application keeps buzzing every few seconds with warnings for various Israeli towns and cities about to receive a visit from a Hamas rocket, including one that was just aimed at my daughter's base. As of this writing, she's okay. This difficult situation is incredibly complex, as I tried to write about. But I wanted to leave you with a note of hope and optimism amidst all of this. This is a picture of my cousin Alon, who is standing right here. He's a doctor outside of Beersheba, and he gathered with Jewish and Arab doctors. These are the doctors of their hospital. All of them are holding signs discussing peace and integration. And even though there are groups of young people who are extremists on both sides who are trying to foment violence, this picture of all of them forming a heart joined together reminds us that there can be still yet a better future. We pray that this violence will end, that Hamas will cease its terrorist activities, and that Israel and her neighbors will again live in peace, and that the Israeli Arab community and the Jewish community will again be at one together.